Pack your things, Howard. You're a glorified property manager, and you're done here. Victor Cole sneered, tossing the crisp white envelope onto the mahogany conference table. The heavy paper slid across the polished wood, stopping right against my worn leather notepad. He had a smug look on his face, the kind of expression only a man who has never worked a real day in his life can wear when destroying someone else's career. He thought he was being brilliant. He thought that by firing me on the spot, he was saving his private equity trust a cool $2 million in transaction commissions on the upcoming sale of Zenith Tower. He had no clue that by handing me that paper, he had just signed the death warrant of his entire $240 million real estate deal. He didn't know that in exactly 30 days, his crown jewel office tower would legally become a useless concrete monument with no power, no running water, and no sewer connection. To understand how a 52-year-old property manager like me ended up holding the ultimate kill switch to a 28-story Class A glass tower, you have to go back 22 years. The year was 2004. Back then, Orange County's commercial district was expanding rapidly, and the plot where Zenith Tower now stands was nothing but a dusty, weed-choked vacant lot surrounded by old warehouses. I was 30 years old, running a small, struggling real estate consulting firm, trying to make a name for myself. The original developers, Zenith Partners, had acquired 3 separate parcels to assemble the site for their ambitious high-rise project. They were aggressive, moving fast, and cutting corners. During my routine research at the county recorder's office, looking at the old plat maps for a client's adjacent warehouse, I noticed a glaring discrepancy. There was a narrow, 15-foot wide strip of land running along the entire western boundary of the Zenith project site. It was a leftover parcel from an old agricultural estate partition from the 1920s, because of a clerical error in a deed description 40 years prior. The parcel was still owned by the heirs of a defunct farming family who had long since moved out of state. The developers of Zenith Tower had completely missed it in their title search. They assumed their land ran all the way to the municipal right-of-way on Industrial Boulevard. I immediately contacted the heirs, who were more than happy to get rid of a useless strip of dirt they didn't even know they owned. I paid $15,000 out of my personal savings to buy that strip under my private holding company, Fletcher Land Holdings, LLC. At the time, I didn't know if I would ever use it, but I knew one basic rule of commercial real estate: never let a key access point go to someone else. 6 months later, Zenith Partners broke ground. That was when their lead architect made a massive error. To connect the tower to the city's main infrastructure grid, the main utility lines, the high-voltage electrical conduits, the 12-inch sanitary sewer line, and the primary fire suppression water mains, had to run through the western boundary of the property. The only way to reach the city's main connection under Industrial Boulevard was to cross my 15-foot strip of land. When the developer's excavation crew showed up and realized they couldn't dig without trespassing on private property, the site manager panicked. The developer's legal team contacted me. They were furious, threatening lawsuits, but their lawyers knew they had no leg to stand on. They had failed their due diligence, and I owned the dirt. They offered to buy the strip for $50,000. I refused. They offered $100,000. I still refused. Eventually, we sat down to negotiate. The lead partner of Zenith Partners was a reasonable old-school builder who realized I held all the cards. I told him I didn't want to extort them, but I wanted security. I agreed to grant them a 50-year utility easement for a nominal annual fee, but the easement agreement would contain a very specific ironclad personal covenant. I drafted the clause myself with my attorney, Edward Vance. Under Section 14-SA of the 2004 Utility Easement Deed, the easement license was explicitly designated as a personal covenant tied directly to my employment. The clause stated, "In the event that Howard Fletcher is no longer employed as the managing director of property management for the dominant estate, or if the management of the property is transferred to an external entity, without the express written consent of Fletcher Lands Holdings, LLC, this utility easement license shall terminate automatically upon a 30-day written notice. Upon termination, the easement holder must cease all usage, disconnect all utility lines, and restore the strip to its original natural state at their sole expense. The developers didn't hesitate. They needed to build, and they figured that hiring a sharp, detail-oriented 30-year-old manager like me to run their new building was a win-win anyway. I knew every bolt, every chiller, every tenant, and every square inch of that concrete. I oversaw the construction, negotiated the original leases, and kept the building at 98% occupancy through 2 economic recessions. For 22 years, I ran Zenith Tower like it was my own. I managed the complex cooling towers, the massive variable air volume HVAC units, the parking garage revenues, and the complicated triple net lease structures for 28 floors of high-profile tenants. The original developers eventually sold the building to Cole Capital REIT in 2018 for a substantial profit. The REIT's board knew my value and kept me on as the managing director of the property. They paid me a handsome base salary, but the real prize was my incentive package, a written agreement granting me a 1% transaction commission on the next sale of the building provided I was managing the asset at the time of the closing. Everything was running smoothly until Victor Cole, the founder's 56-year-old son, took over as the managing partner of the REIT last year. Victor was a modern corporate raider type. He wore bespoke suits, talked constantly about optimizing shareholder value, and viewed the staff who actually ran the properties as overhead expenses. He didn't care about relationships. He didn't care about contract law. And he certainly didn't care about a property manager who had spent 22 years maintaining the concrete foundations of his family's wealth. He only cared about one thing: the massive exit valuation he could get by flipping Zenith Tower to a German pension fund, Allianz Globus Capital, for $240 million, and to maximize his personal payout, he decided that my $2 million commission was a line item he simply didn't want to pay. The trouble began 3 weeks ago when Victor Cole called me into the penthouse suite of Zenith Tower. The room was filled with stacks of leather-bound binders and large presentation boards showing the underwriting details of the transaction with the German pension fund, Allianz Globus Capital. The purchase price was locked at $240 million, based on a capitalization rate of 6.5%. In commercial real estate, the math is simple but brutal. The valuation is directly tied to your net operating income, or NOI. To justify a $240 million price tag, Zenith Tower had to show a stable, verifiable annual NOI of $15,600,000. Victor was pacing behind his glass desk, chewing on the end of an expensive pen. Beside him sat Julian Drake, the facilities director of Apex Dynamics. Apex was our anchor tenant, occupying 4 full floors, 120,000 square feet, and paying $5,400,000 annually in rent. They were the financial backbone of the building. Their lease was solid, with 8 years remaining, but they also possessed a strict clause giving them the right to audit our annual triple net, or NNN, expense reconciliations. "Howard, sit down," Victor said, not looking up. "We have a slight bump in the underwriting. The Germans are auditing the operating expenses. They want to see the signed estoppel certificates from all major tenants by Friday." An estoppel certificate, as you know, is the legal document where the property manager and the tenant formally verify the current rent, the lease terms, and any outstanding disputes. It's what the buyer's bank uses to verify the building's cash flow. I nodded. "I've already prepared the draft estoppels. Apex's base rent is $45 per square foot. They have no outstanding defaults, and we are currently in the middle of a routine audit of last year's utility allocations." Victor stopped pacing and leaned over the desk. He slid a modified document toward me. "We're changing the terms, Howard. The Germans want to see a higher yield. I've drafted a new estoppel certificate for Apex Dynamics. It states that their current rent is $52 per square foot, and that they have signed an amendment waiving their right to audit the common area maintenance fees for the remainder of their lease. I've also added a retroactive charge of $4,800,000 in utility reconciliations that they supposedly owed from the pandemic years." I stared at the document. The numbers had been completely fabricated. The base rent was inflated by $7 a square foot, which added nearly $840,000 of pure fake profit to the annual NOI. Combined with the waiver of audit rights and the fake $4,800,000 retroactive bill, this document would artificially inflate the building's valuation by almost $13 million. Victor, this isn't accurate, I said, my voice steady. Apex never agreed to $52 a square foot, and they certainly don't owe $4.8 million in retroactive utility fees. Our actual utility logs show we were under budget. If I sign this and Julian Drake signs his part, we are committing outright fraud. The buyers are a regulated European pension fund. If their auditors cross-reference this with the actual bank deposits and tax filings, they'll catch it immediately. It's a violation of federal securities law under SEC Rule 10b-5. Victor's face flushed red. He slammed his hand on the desk. I don't need a lecture on securities law from a property manager, Howard. The buyer's underwriters are only doing a spot check. Once the deal closes, the new owners will absorb the cost, and Apex won't challenge the rent because we'll offer them a tenant improvement allowance next year to offset it. It's a paper adjustment. It happens all the time in private equity. I'm not signing it, I said, pushing the paper back. My signature on an estoppel certificate is a legal declaration of truth. I have managed this building for 22 years with a spotless record. I am not going to jail or losing my license to help you squeeze an extra $13 million out of a German pension fund. Julian Drake, who had been sitting quietly, spoke up. Howard is right, Victor. If you send this to my corporate office, our legal counsel will flag it in 5 minutes. We will sue Cole Capital for breach of contract and file a formal complaint for fraud. Victor glared at Julian, then turned his gaze back to me. His eyes were cold, filled with a mixture of arrogance and desperation. You think you're indispensable, don't you, Howard? You think because you've been here since the dirt road days that you own this place. Let me remind you of something. You are an employee, a glorified custodian. You make sure the lights stay on and the toilets flush. Any junior leasing agent can sign these documents. I'm giving you until 3 o'clock this afternoon to sign this estoppel and get it over to the underwriters. If you don't, I will find someone who will. I stood up, picked up my notepad, and looked him dead in the eye. My answer won't change at 3 o'clock, Victor. At exactly 3:15, my desk phone rang. It was Victor's assistant asking me to come to the main boardroom on the 28th floor. When I walked in, Victor was sitting at the head of the table. Beside him was the REIT's head of human resources. There were no underwriters, no lawyers, just a cold, sterile corporate firing squad. Without saying a word, Victor slid the white envelope across the table. You're fired for insubordination, effective immediately, Victor said, his voice dripping with spite. We've already revoked your system access. Under Clause 9 of your employment agreement, termination for cause forfeits any rights to future transaction commissions. That means your $2 million payout on the sale of this building is officially null and void. You have 2 hours to pack your personal belongings. HR will escort you out. The HR representative looked uncomfortable, keeping her eyes fixed on her tablet. I looked down at the letter. It was signed by Victor. I could feel the hot blood rushing to my ears, the instinct to scream, to point out the 22 years of 70-hour work weeks, the late-night plumbing emergencies, the tenants I had personally saved from bankruptcy. But I took a deep breath, letting the anger settle into a cold, hard focus. I thought about the 2004 deed tucked away in the fireproof safe in my home office. I picked up the envelope, slipped it into my jacket pocket, and stood up. Understood, I said calmly. No scene? Victor mocked, leaning back in his chair. No begging for your job? I thought you loved this building, Howard. I do love the building, Victor, I said, offering a faint, polite smile. But I think you're going to find that the building doesn't love you back. I walked back to my office, packed my family photos, my personal notebook, and my favorite coffee mug into a small cardboard box. By 5 o'clock, I was standing in the parking lot, watching the sun reflect off the glass facade of Zenith Tower. I got into my truck and dialed my attorney, Edward Vance. Edward Vance's law office was a quiet, wood-paneled sanctuary in a low-rise building a few miles away from the gleaming glass of the commercial center. Edward was 55, a seasoned real estate litigation attorney, with a sharp mind and a dry sense of humor. He was also the man who 22 years ago had helped me draft the utility easement deed that now sat on the table between us. He had his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead as he examined the yellowed original copy of the 2004 deed, bearing the official stamp of the Orange County Recorder's Office. "They really fired you, Howard?" Edward asked, looking up. "No transition period? No negotiation?" "Nen," I said, taking a sip of the lukewarm coffee he'd offered. "Victor Cole wants to pocket the $2 million transaction commission. He claimed insubordination because I refused to sign a fraudulent estoppel certificate that lied about the anchor tenant's rent. He gave me 2 hours to clear out." Edward smiled, a slow, dangerous grin. "Victor Cole is a very smart boy who has never read his own property files. He thinks a title report is just a piece of paper you pay an insurance company to clear. Let's look at Section 14 sa again." He tapped his finger on the paragraph we had drafted over 2 decades ago. The language was beautiful in its simplicity. It stated that the utility easement license granted to the dominant estate, the parcel on which Zenith Tower stood, was strictly conditional upon my personal employment as the managing director of the property. The moment I was terminated without cause, or if the management was transferred without the written consent of Fletcher Land Holdings LLC, the license would automatically terminate. "Here is the beauty of this covenant," Edward explained, leaning back in his chair. "This isn't just a personal agreement between you and the original developer. It was recorded against the deed of the land. It runs with the land. That means Cole Capital REIT, as the current owner, is legally bound by it. Furthermore, because it's a utility easement, the municipal utility companies, Southern California Edison for the electricity, the regional water district, and the sanitation district for the sewer, are technically using private land owned by Fletcher Land Holdings LLC to service a third party without a permanent public right-of-way." "What are our options?" I asked. "We exercise the clause," Edward said. "I will draft a formal notice of easement revocation. We will give them exactly 30 days' notice as required by the deed. We will send this notice via certified mail to 3 entities. First, Cole Capital REIT. Second, the utility companies, informing them that their legal license to route their lines through your 15-foot strip is terminating, and that they must decommission their conduits. And third, the title insurance company representing the German buyers, Allianz Globus Capital." I leaned forward. "What happens if the utility companies decommission the lines?" "The building becomes legally uninhabitable," Edward replied. "Under municipal building codes, a commercial high-rise cannot operate without active sanitary sewer systems, fire suppression water lines, and primary electrical feeds. If the utilities are cut off, the city will issue an immediate vacate order. No tenants can enter. The building becomes a giant, expensive paperweight. Can Victor just reroute the utilities?" I asked, playing devil's advocate. "He's got plenty of money." Edward pulled up a GIS map of the property on his computer screen. "Look at the boundaries, Howard. To the north, you have the Municipal Wetlands Preserve. The city will never grant a utility corridor permit through a protected habitat. To the east and south, the tower is bordered by the parking structures of 2 rival real estate trusts. Those companies hate Cole Capital. They've been fighting over shared access roads for a decade. They will never grant Victor an easement, or if they do, they'll charge him tens of millions of dollars. The only open boundary that connects Zenith Tower to the public utility mains under Industrial Boulevard is the western edge. And that western edge is your 15-foot strip of dirt." He zoomed in on the map. "If they try to bypass your strip, they would have to run the lines under the public road on the far south corner, which requires a special municipal variance, environmental impact reports, and major street closures. It would take at least 18 months to get the permits, cost upwards of $10 million in engineering fees, and completely disrupt the entire commercial district. The German buyers aren't going to wait 18 months for a deal to close." "Let's do it," I said. "Send the notices." By noon the next day, Edward had drafted and dispatched the legal packets. The certified mail receipts were logged, and the clock began to tick. I spent the first few days of my unemployment doing yard work, fishing, and enjoying the quiet of my home. For 22 years, I had been on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I had rushed to Zenith Tower at 3 in the morning to handle blown electrical transformers, burst main valves, and tenant lockouts. Now, for the first time, the giant building's problems were no longer my problems. On the 10th day after the notices were sent, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but the area code matched the REIT's corporate office. I ignored it. A few minutes later, the same number called again. I ignored it again. Then came the emails, sent to my personal address. They were from the REIT's general counsel, requesting an urgent conference call to clarify administrative misunderstanding. I forwarded every single email and phone log to Edward Vance. The instructions were simple. All communication must go through my legal counsel. By the 15th day, the tone of the emails changed from polite requests to frantic demands. The German buyer's due diligence team had uncovered the easement dispute during their title search. The title insurance company, First American Title, had immediately flag-noted the transaction. They refused to issue a clean title insurance policy to Allianz Globus Capital until the easement issue was resolved. Without title insurance, the German fund's bank could not release the $240 million acquisition loan. The 240M deal had ground to a screeching halt, and the 30-day clock was down to 15 days. By the 20th day of the 30-day notice period, the chaos at Zenith Tower had reached a boiling point. The structural foundations of Victor Cole's real estate empire were beginning to crack, and he was powerless to stop it. First came the official letter from Southern California Edison. They notified Cole Capital REIT that, in accordance with the formal notice of easement revocation filed by Fletcher Land Holdings LLC, they had scheduled a crew for Tuesday morning on the 30th day. The crew would physically disconnect the main electrical transformers feeding the tower's primary switchgear room. Without an active easement, the utility provider was legally prohibited from trespassing on my land to maintain the high-voltage lines. 2 hours later, a similar letter arrived from the Orange County Sanitation District. They were scheduling the capping of the 12-inch main sewer line that ran under my strip of land. Without a sewer connection, the building could not legally remain open. Under California health and safety codes, the city would be forced to issue a mandatory red tag vacate order within 24 hours of the shutdown. The German pension fund, Allianz Globus Capital, did not hesitate. Their legal counsel sent a formal warning of default to Cole Capital REIT. Under Section 8.2 of the Purchase and Sale Agreement, the seller was required to deliver clean, unencumbered title at closing. If the easement issue was not resolved, and the utility disconnect notices were not withdrawn by the closing date, the Germans would cancel the transaction, demand the immediate return of their $24 million earnest money deposit, and sue for $5 million in sunk due diligence and legal costs. But the final fatal blow came from Apex Dynamics. Julian Drake had kept his word. The moment his legal department received copy notices of the utility disconnects, they issued a formal letter to Victor Cole. If the electrical power or sanitation services to their 120,000 square foot office space were interrupted for even a single hour, Apex would declare Cole Capital REIT in material breach of the lease. They would immediately vacate the premises, terminate their lease agreement, stop paying their $540,000 monthly rent, and file a lawsuit for $25 million in damages for business interruption, server downtime, and relocation costs. If Apex Dynamics walked out, the remaining tenants would follow. 80% of the leases in the building contained a standard co-tenancy clause. This clause allowed smaller tenants to terminate their leases or demand a 50% rent reduction if the anchor tenant vacated the property. Without Apex, the building's occupancy would drop from 98% to less than 40%. Overnight, the value of Zenith Tower would plummet from $240 million to less than $80 million. Victor Cole's cell phone log must have looked like a disaster zone. My personal phone had recorded exactly 103 missed calls from his corporate line and his personal number. He had left dozens of voicemails, his tone shifting from angry threats to desperate pleas. I had ignored every single one of them. Finally, on the 25th day, Victor's personal attorney contacted Edward Vance. They agreed to all of Edward's terms for a face-to-face meeting. The meeting took place in the main conference room of Edward's law firm. When Victor Cole walked in, he looked like a shadow of the arrogant executive who had fired me 3 weeks prior. His expensive Italian suit looked rumpled, his tie was loosened, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He was accompanied by a senior real estate attorney from a major corporate firm in Los Angeles. Victor sat down, slammed his leather briefcase on the table, and glared at me. "This is extortion, Howard. You're holding a $240 million transaction hostage over a worthless strip of dirt. My legal team is prepared to file an emergency injunction in Superior Court to block this easement termination. We will sue you personally for tortious interference and demand punitive damages that will bankrupt you and your family." Edward Vance didn't even look up from his tablet. He slowly took off his reading glasses and laid them on the table. "You can file whatever you like, counselor," Edward said, looking at Victor's attorney. "But we both know the law. The easement deed was signed in 2004 and recorded legally with the county. It contains a clear, unambiguous personal covenant. Your client, Cole Capital REIT, purchased this building in 2018. Your title insurance company did a search, and this deed was in the public record. You had constructive notice of the terms. Your client chose to terminate Howard Fletcher without cause, knowing, or rather, failing to know because of your own incompetence, that doing so would trigger Section 14C. Victor's attorney cleared his throat, looking highly uncomfortable. "Mr. Vance, we believe the clause could be interpreted as an unreasonable restraint on alienation of property. A court might find it unenforceable." "A court might," Edward countered smoothly, "but a court hearing won't happen for at least 6 months. In the meantime, the utility companies are legally required to disconnect their lines in 5 days because they have no active license to cross my client's land. Southern California Edison has already confirmed they will not risk a trespass lawsuit. If the utilities are cut, Apex Dynamics terminates their lease, the German buyers walk away, and the building gets red-tagged by the city. By the time we get to court, Zenith Tower will be an empty, bankrupt shell. Is your client prepared to lose a $240 million asset to test your legal theory in court?" The boardroom fell dead silent. Victor Cole stared at the polished mahogany table, his knuckles turning white as he clenched his fists. He looked at his lawyer, hoping for a lifeline, but the corporate attorney simply gave a subtle, defeated shake of his head. "What do you want, Howard?" Victor asked, his voice barely a whisper, the arrogance completely gone. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "Here are my terms, Victor." I opened my leather notebook and read from the list I had prepared with Edward. "First, Cole Capital REIT will pay my transaction commission of $2 million in full, immediately upon the closing of the sale of Zenith Tower. This commission was earned through 22 years of managing the asset, and you will not cheat me out of it." Victor began to open his mouth to protest, but his attorney put a hand on his arm, silencing him. "Second," I continued, "Fletcher Land Holdings LLC will sell the 15-foot western boundary strip to Cole Capital REIT for a purchase price of $3 million. This will merge the easement into a permanent fee, simple ownership, resolving the utility issue forever and allowing you to deliver a clean title to the German pension fund. You bought the tower for $240 million. Paying $3 million to save the deal is a small price." Victor's face turned pale. $5 million total? That's insane. That's outright theft." "No, Victor," I said calmly. "It's a market transaction. You wanted to play corporate chess, but you forgot to look at the board. Third, you will sign a settlement agreement stating my termination was without cause, and you will issue a full liability release for both me and Fletcher Land Holdings LLC. There will be no future lawsuits, no retaliation, and no negative references in the industry." "And what if I say no?" Victor sneered, trying to summon some of his old bravado. "We can still fight this." Edward Vance reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder, sliding it across the table toward Victor's attorney. "If you say no, we will immediately file a formal complaint with the Securities and Exchange Commission, detailing the fraudulent estoppel certificates you tried to force Howard to sign. We have already sent a copy of this folder, along with the actual utility logs and Apex's real lease terms, to the board of directors of Cole Capital REIT. Victor froze. The color drained from his face completely. Your father, Richard Cole, and the rest of the board members were very interested to learn how you almost exposed their entire public trust to federal criminal fraud charges and civil lawsuits just to inflate the NOI by $13 million. Edward added, holding Victor's gaze. In fact, we received a call from your father's personal counsel this morning. The board has already drafted a resolution to remove you as managing partner for gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. If you do not resign voluntarily as part of this settlement, they will fire you publicly at the next shareholder meeting. Victor looked at the folder, then at his attorney. The corporate lawyer took one look at the documents inside the folder, which contained the forged estoppel certificate with Victor's handwritten corrections on it, and closed it. Victor, the lawyer said quietly, you need to sign now. It took 2 days to finalize the paperwork. The board of Cole Capital REIT moved quickly to contain the damage. They accepted Victor's immediate resignation to pursue other opportunities, and his father, Richard Cole, personally signed the settlement agreement on behalf of the REIT. A week later, the transaction with Allianz Globus Capital closed successfully. The title insurance company cleared the title once the deed transfer for the 15-foot strip was recorded. On the day of the closing, I sat on the porch of my home, holding a cup of fresh coffee. My phone buzzed with a notification from my bank. The wire transfer had cleared, $5 million, representing my $2 million commission and the $3 million purchase price for the land. After taxes and Edward's legal fees, I was left with more than enough wealth to ensure my family would never have to worry about money again. A few weeks later, I read in the Wall Street Journal that Victor Cole had been quietly barred from serving as an officer in any public real estate trust for a period of 5 years as part of a settlement with the SEC. His career in commercial real estate was effectively over. I ended up selling my house in Orange County and buying a beautiful, quiet ranch in western Montana, near the mountains. Sometimes, when I'm sitting on the deck watching the sun set over the plains, I think about Zenith Tower. I think about the 22 years I spent walking its concrete corridors, checking the pressure valves on the chillers, and greeting the tenants. I don't regret a single day of the hard work I put into that building, but I'm glad I kept that 15-foot strip of dirt. In the end, the concrete and glass belonged to the investors, but the ground beneath their feet belonged to me.